Okay, so I see that David Kudur has joined. Can we also make him a co-host, please?
Yes, we will do that.
Okay. So we are ready to start?
Yes, almost. Just now we can start.
Okay, perfect.
Hello, everybody.
So, hi, David. Welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Okay, so good morning, good afternoon, good evening for everyone that has joined the webinar today. We are starting on time and hopefully we will continue to be on time. On behalf of the 4 co-organizers, the Global Research Forum on Diaspora and Transnationalism, Migrant Forum in Asia, the Civil Society Action Committee, and the Cross-Regional Center for Refugees and Migrants, welcome to everyone who has joined our discussion today. This is actually the second webinar of a series of 23 webinars. The 23 webinars are focusing on each and every objective of the Global Compact on Migration that was adopted 2 years ago in 2018 in Marrakesh. Today's webinar is really about drivers of migration. It's about Objective 2, which is minimizing the adverse drivers of migration. I think this is one of the big topics to be dealt with. I think this is one of the big webinars, precisely because this is a topic that connects to so many other issues. It's not just about migration per se, it's about conditions at home. It's about what really compels people to leave their country of origin. What kind of conditions do we have there? We often hear about making, migration a question of choice, migration out of choice, but not migration out of necessity. And I think in today's webinar, we will be able to deconstruct what does choice really mean, deconstruct, what does it mean not to have to migrate out of necessity. With us today, we have very well-known speakers from a diversity of backgrounds and disciplines. We have 5 speakers joining us today to really explain to us what does it mean when we talk about drivers, what does it mean to also minimize these drivers, what needs to be done, because our webinar series is also focusing on action, and part of this is also focusing on reviewing also the action that has happened from 2018 until where we are today. So this is also part of the webinar itself. I will introduce our speakers. I will not focus too much on introductions because our speakers are, experts and very well known in their fields. I will just introduce for the sake of starting the conversation. Our first speaker is actually Professor Walden Bellow. Professor Bellow is an environmentalist, a journalist, a social worker, educator, a writer, so all these kind of varieties of disciplines and experiences. He's also currently a professor of sociology at the State University of New York at Birmingham, and a senior research fellow at the Center of Southeast Asian Studies at Kyoto University in Japan, in addition to many other affiliations and many other inclusions. Welcome, Professor Bellow. We are very happy that you are with us here today. Our second speaker is Vivian Van Der Wu. Vivian is the IOM Senior Regional Project Manager for Displacement Tracking Matrix and the Regional Evidence for Migration Analysis and Policy Project. She is based in IOM's Regional Office for Asia and the Pacific. Welcome, Vivian. Very happy that you're with us today. Our third speaker, and this is again in order of how we will proceed, is David Kudur. He is the Human Mobility Advisor within the Recovery Solution and Human Mobility Team at the UNDP Crisis Bureau in New York City. Before he joined UNDP, David also worked as the head of Migration and Skills Unit at the OECD Development Center in Paris, and was the chair of the Nomad Thematic Working Group on Policy and Institutional Coherence. Welcome, David. We are happy you're with us today. Our fourth speaker, is Shamim Ahlan Chaudhary Noman, who is the Secretary General of the Bangladeshi Association of International Recruitment Agencies. Welcome, Shamim. We're very happy to be joined by recruitment agencies and the Association of Recruitment Agencies from the ground in Bangladesh as well. Welcome, very happy that you are with us as well. Our fifth speaker is Bichaya Rai Shrestha, who is a returnee woman migrant herself. She worked in Japan and returned from Japan. Bichaya is also a founding chairperson of AMCAS Nepal, which is an organization of returnee women in migration, which was founded in 2016. Thanks for being with us today, Bichaya, and welcome. Our last speaker, but evidently not least, is Kylie Ober. Kylie is the Senior Advocate and Program Manager of the Climate Displacement Program at Refugee International. Before working for Refugee International, Kylie was actually working as a policy specialist for the Asian Development Bank and was a consultant at the World Bank, where she authored flagship report on grounds while preparing for internal climate migration. Very warm welcome to you, Kylie. Very happy that you are with us as well. So this is to introduce our sixth speaker for today. Before we get started with the discussion itself, I would just like to highlight a few ground rules. Our speakers will each go for about 8 minutes, possibly, if time allows, followed by a follow-up question, just drawing on what the speaker has said. We are trying to make these as much as possible of a conversational format, so to foster interaction, to foster building on each other's thought in the webinar. So I would urge all our speakers to try to build on what the previous speaker said, if we agree or we disagree. There will also be a window for interaction. We will try as much as possible to have comments from the floor after our speakers have made their initial interventions. So if you have a question or you have a comment and you'd like to come in, please let me know. I'll try as much as possible to accommodate a few people from the floor. After that, we will return again to our speakers and panelists for a final round of comments and thoughts based on what we are hearing from the floor, and then we will conclude this webinar. Just to get started with today's very interesting discussion, and maybe Professor Bellow, we can start with you. We've often heard you speak about the need to find alternative modes of growth in the South. We've heard this coming from you, an alternative mode that is not consumption-driven, as the current model that is today. When we talk about the GCM Objective 2, which is addressing drivers of migration, there is a strong emphasis on the SDG agenda as a way to realize this minimizing of drivers themselves. So, I mean, my first question to you, and this is really to kind of frame the discussion, is the implementation of the SDG agenda in itself enough for the Global South, or do we need to think of a much wider framing?
Okay, yes, thank you very much, Ms. Hamati. I had prepared a brief statement addressing the topic of internal drivers. Can I read that statement? I wasn't quite prepared to be asked a question right off.
Yes, we can start with the statement, and if we have time, we can come back.
Yes. Okay. In fact, I had sent this. I would just like to illustrate the internal structural drivers of the export of labor. That is the topic today. And I will focus on two countries, the very names of which are associated with labor migration, the Philippines and Mexico. Now, the Philippines and Mexico as labor exporters, their role cannot be divorced from the dynamics of neoliberal capitalism. In the case of the Philippines, the labor export program began in the mid-70s as a temporary program under the Marcos dictatorship, with a relatively small number of workers involved, about 50,000. The ballooning of labor migration to encompass over 10 million Filipinos working in almost all countries in the world today, or some 10% of the population, owes much to the devastation of the economy and jobs by the structural adjustment policies imposed by the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund beginning in 1980, trade liberalization under the World Trade Organization, and the prioritization of debt repayment by the post-Marcos governments in national economic policy since 1986. Now, structural adjustment resulted in deindustrialization and the loss of so many manufacturing jobs. Trade liberalization pushed so many peasants out of agriculture, a great number directly to overseas employment, and prioritization of debt repayments robbed the government of resources for capital expenditures that could act as an engine of economic growth, since 20 to 40% of the budget went every year to servicing the debt. Not surprisingly, according to the Human Development Report of the United Nations Development Program, with a growth in GDP per capita averaging 1.6% per annum in the period 1990 to 2005, the Philippines' economic growth record was the worst in Southeast Asia, with even all the so-called lower-tier ASEAN countries significantly outstripping it. I am not saying that only structural adjustment is to blame for driving people to seek work abroad. There was, of course, the already existing wealth and income inequality. There was population pressure, and here one must note that one of the culprits was the Catholic Church hierarchy that strongly opposed women's reproductive rights and family planning, so that the country's population growth rate remained at a high 2.5%, even as the country's neighbors were able to reduce theirs to 1% or below. Perhaps it is more appropriate to say that structural adjustment interacted with these other variables to create a vicious cycle that drove people to seek work elsewhere. In the role that structural adjustment and trade liberalization played in creating pressures for labor migration, the experience of the Philippines parallels that of Mexico. The North American Free Trade Agreement allowed cheap US corn to flood into Mexico after 1994, severely destabilizing the production of corn, Mexico's main crop. At the same time, structural adjustment policies decimated Mexico's manufacturing sector beginning in the 1990s. Import tariffs were lowered from 50% to 20%, and import licenses were eliminated, resulting in the closing down of hundreds of factories, with the labor-intensive domestic textile and clothing sector brink of extinction. Now, what this meant was that the manufacturing sector was itself expelling workers and certainly could not absorb the millions of farmers being displaced by cheap imported corn. One estimate put the number of these farmers as 15 million. With very little absorptive capacity from industry, the choice of many peasants was enduring poverty in their homes or in the slums of Mexico City or migrating to the United States. Many opted for the latter. As the economic crisis fueled by structural adjustment and the North American Free Trade Act deepened, migration hit unprecedented levels, with net annual migratory flow in the 1990s being 10 times higher than that recorded for the 80s. By 2006, roughly 10% of Mexico's population of 107 million was living in the United States. About 15% of Mexico's labor force was working there, and 1 out of every 7 Mexican workers was working there. There was a strong element of truth in the sardonic comment that eking a living from agriculture extremely impossible, Mexico's peasantry simply moved to the United States. In sum, labor export has served as an economic safety valve, absorbing surplus labor created by neoliberal policies in dependent capitalist countries like Mexico and the Philippines. I would just like to conclude by one other observation that is often missed. Labor export unfortunately also acts as a political safety valve that deflects popular energies from accumulating to a critical mass to which the elites cannot but respond with major social and political reforms. I think this is the dirty secret that has made the Mexican elite so tolerant of migration to the United States, and the Philippine elites create a massive labor export administration to manage the process. The Philippines has often been complimented for creating what many have regarded as a relatively efficient system of labor deployment abroad, that is the envy of other governments. I see it differently. This system functions first and foremost as a political safety valve, channeling outward energies that would otherwise have been a source of progressive change. Let me end there, but I would just like to add that I was a member of the parliament in the Philippines, the House of Representatives, where I was chair of the House Committee on Overseas Workers Affairs, an extremely frustrating task because of the major problems that confront migration. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Bellow, and I think it's a really good way for us to get started on discussing drivers of migration and discussing exactly how we cannot dissociate the economic conditions, the global economic conditions from what kind of constitutes as an essential driver to migration. And I think there's a crucial point that maybe we can come back to later during the webinar, which is really how, in certain cases, countries of origin have focused overwhelmingly on promoting migration as a way to really not have to deal with issues back at home, with things that need to happen back at home to ensure that people have the livelihoods that they should have as well at home. Thank you very much, Professor Bellow. We will certainly return back to you for further discussion.
Thank you.
Vivian, thank you. Vivian, if I can go to you. We've heard that from the case of the Philippines and Mexico, how certain conditions came together to really constitute a strong driver to migration, where people did not really have a choice. I know through your work at IOM, you have also looked at drivers, maybe from a different context as well. You have done also a kind of an academic research on the drivers of migration in the context of Bangladesh and other countries in the region. What are some of the findings that you are seeing as the main drivers of migration, and how are they different between different countries? And maybe I can ask you as well to break it down for us. Is it different in terms of the different countries that people go to as countries of destination, or are the drivers the same in that kind of layering approach? To you, Vivian.
Thank you. And first of all, welcome everybody. It's nice to see such a diverse group of participants. Before I dive a bit into to my short statement, I would like to stress that I've been working in migration for over a decade. And I've been very lucky the last years, because I started off as a scholar, as an academic. And then I joined IOM, where I was very practical on the ground, trying to do programs with migrants. And then since the last couple of years, I actually can combine the two. So bringing a bit of the research on the table, but keeping a very close operational mindset. So I wanted to give actually I wanted to throw some thoughts out there, because what I've been doing since 2016 now, and it has really evolved over time, because we learn and the landscape also becomes much more broad when it comes to this type of research. I've been trying to understand drivers through two very large data collection exercises. One is called the Comprehensive Migration Flow Survey, where we have done thousands and thousands of surveys with migrants before, during the migration route, in the final destination, upon return, families left behind, to really create that picture. And when we started, the reason why we wanted to go a little bit here, and this is something I really want to stress, is that drivers of migration is not something new within the landscape, especially in the landscape of scholars. I mean, there are the whole migration theory out there, and especially, I mean, there are quite some orthodox theories still there, have only been really questioned lately, since a couple of years, where the debate is finally going and is going much more in depth. So one example is the push-pull theory, where we have now the push-pull plus theory. And this is also something I am trying to do with the IOM teams on the ground, is to actually take the whole drivers outside of the very classic box, which says, okay, drivers are often either economic or they are like involuntary or forced. So what we are trying to do is we are obviously looking at those main key drivers, which are fueled in the more like orthodox theories, but also trying to bring new things to the table that scholars can actually go more in depth. And what you see more and more now, and also the debate, is to find alternative conceptualizations. So what we are trying to do is we are trying to, first of all, not only look into those general drivers, but to really look at individual level, the micro situation. So, and we are doing individual interviews, thousands and thousands of them. So what is this micro level situation of that migrant, either potential or the one that has already migrated? What are the role of social relations? What is the role of culture? How is the world viewed? And what is the recent influence of social media? We are really underestimating the role of social media. And then, of course, it comes with a set of economic opportunities, because the poorest of the poor in general cannot migrate internationally, right? So you need to be lifted out of a certain level of poverty. And then how do people choose countries? Is this because of how they see the world? We are looking into the type of information they have. We are looking into the type of social networks they have, and what are the political controls. And what we have learned is that, and we are not there yet, if you really want to understand drivers, it is important to first of all understand that in general, the overall micro level triggers are quite similar. But in order to understand the multi-complexity of the drivers, you really need to look into the geographies, the actual emotional value migrants have for particular things, social relations, obligations migrants have. So often the role of the social network or the social pressure is underestimated. Things like that. And also we often underestimate displacement and previous migration experience. So what do we see? We see definitely difference in particular educational backgrounds and social network leads to different migration. Absolutely. However, we often then, when we look at actual triggers, because people often don't look at an individual trigger, this then can also be more generalized. The core motivations are often the same when we look at, for example, migration from Nigeria, or migration from Iraq, or migration from Afghanistan, or migration from Bangladesh. But the actual situation on the ground and the small triggers that are there are different and are often very culturally linked. So therefore, what we are trying to build the evidence now, and we will continue for another 3 years. So this will then in the end be solid 7 to 8 years of research, is to step out of the classic box and to look at it more nuanced, and to hopefully together, especially with the academic world, with the scholars out there, to try to also step away from the classic orthodox migration theories and to see if we can bring more nuance there. Thank you.
Thank you, Vivian. And if you'll allow me to follow up there with you a little bit on the spot. So you are talking about moving a little bit from the classical understanding of migration as as an economic drivers of migration, into looking more at the macro level. If I can ask you in terms of practicalities on the ground, having this understanding of the micro drivers. How can we use this? How can, for instance, an agency like the IOM, who is very operational by nature, use these better understandings of drivers in programs, but also beyond this, when talking about migration?
Yeah, so one of the examples, which is even a more complex model we have built, and I'm showing here, is Afghanistan, where every 6 months we are trying to understand in the communities where we know there's high in or out migration, internal and international, trying to first of all understand the numbers, right? The actual numbers. And then what we do in those communities is to collect information on general indicators, from livelihood to wash to security to, call it social cohesion. And based upon those, plus we have the drivers of migration survey on a regular basis, which even goes more in depth. What we do with all of this information, we triangulate, and we see, for example, that don't quote me on this because I'm just picking 2 provinces, not correct, that for example in Kandahar, the approach of integration or regulation of displacement needs a very different approach than Ghor. Why? Because the basic needs there are very different. And if you don't understand the basic needs within that community that drive migration, then you cannot stop basic migration. On top of that, when people economically develop, they often migrate, but then there are different needs as well. So we try to build those layers, and we do interventions based upon this. And not only us, there are many others in Afghanistan, luckily.
Thank you, Vivian. It's really very fascinating to also hear about the data collection that you and the team are doing. So thank you for sharing that with us. It's definitely food for thought for us. If I can go to you, David, and we are hearing different things about drivers, and obviously one of the drivers that is classically heard of is the lack of employment at home. So my question to you is, how can generating sustainable livelihoods be a positive force in mitigating drivers and creating durable solutions for potential migrants?
Thanks, Rula. Hello, everybody. We have lots of people connected, so thanks everybody for your interest in better understanding this issue of drivers. I would like to start saying that it's very important to remind that migration is an individual choice, and sometimes it's like a little bit dangerous to say that we want to mitigate the adverse drivers of migration, because something that can be considered from outside, from international organizations, policymakers, as something negative, and people are forced to migrate and it's not a decision. But at the end, for many people, even though they are living in very difficult situations, it's still a decision and it's still a choice. So we have to be careful about deciding from outside what is choice and what is decision, because we might have a different opinion. And then also we shouldn't forget, when every time we discuss about mitigating the adverse drivers of migration, that migration is also a force of development. It's a driver of development, and so we cannot disconnect that. And trying to let people at home and say, no, they are better at home and we have to make the conditions so that they can live in better conditions. Let's not forget, it's an individual choice, and migration contributes and has contributed to development in many countries. And that being said, and Vivian already mentioned that not the poorest people from the poorest countries are those who migrate. Those who migrate are usually middle-class people from middle-income countries. And the huge amount of people in the world migrating come from middle-income countries, not from the poorest countries. So that's very important to remind when we talk about the drivers of migration. What does it mean? It means that when we take the poorest countries, when we take the poorest people, and we invest in economic development, we invest in having them in better conditions, they tend to migrate more. This is what all the migration experts call the migration hump. We know that when we have economic development in most countries, that translates into more immigration, not less. So this is a huge challenge in terms of public policies and in terms of interventions, because when you relieve the financial constraint that people have, then they tend to migrate more. So when you are telling we need to provide livelihoods to people, one paradox is that at the end they might migrate more. There are some studies showing that, for instance, when you provide cash transfers to people, you are providing some financial help. They might use, there are studies in the Philippines, for instance, or in Mexico, and when you provide cash transfer, they might use this to migrate more. So this is all a paradox, and this is a huge challenge. Does it mean that you shouldn't do anything? No. There are leeway, we have leeways to act, we have room for acting, and to make that actually to reach this point where migration is really a choice and not by force. So I would like to give us some examples of that. First, you were talking about employment. So this is really part of this paradox, because many times people from developing countries who migrate, they already have a job. So access to job is not the reason why people, or the lack of access to job is not the main reason why people migrate or don't migrate. However, when you have sustainability in your job, that you have some security, that improves. And studies show that, for instance, when you have active labor market policy, that you have better labor market functioning, that you have job agencies working well, then people have more access to job. They can also foster internal mobility. Sometimes it's easier to find a job abroad than finding a job in other parts of the country. So if you are able to foster internal mobility, you can have less incentives to migrate abroad, but more incentives to stay within the country. So active labor market policies and stable employment, stable jobs contribute in the long term to deterring migration incentives. The second example is social protection. Most studies show that the more you invest in social protection, the less people tend to migrate. So that means that if you have two countries with exact same economic conditions, but one is investing in social protection, in providing access to health, access to pension, access to quality education, and the other is not, then the country which is investing in social protection will have lower emigration rates. So this is a key component of these public policies, which can have a significant impact on the decision to migrate. A third example is everything related with agriculture. When you invest in providing stable income for people working in agriculture, or more broadly in rural areas, this is contributing to deterring migration too, and the worst conditions of migration. Crop insurance. Crop insurance is a good way to have people staying at home, because one reason why in rural areas people tend to migrate is because they are losing everything. They don't have security about what is happening with their income. So all the policies, or most policies, aiming at providing stable income for people in rural areas contribute actually to deterring migration and the worst forms of migration. And the last word is about gender. I think it's very important also to disaggregate the drivers of migration by sex. And there are lots of studies showing that women in developing countries migrate for additional reasons than men, and not just for family reunification. That's the old story. But discriminatory social norms have a strong impact on the decision to migrate of women. So one way to make women migrate by choice and not by force is precisely to reduce gender inequalities, and to have social norms, social institutions which are less discriminatory and will help them have better opportunities at home. So these are some examples of concrete policies: labor market policies, social protection, agriculture, and let's say gender equality, which might have a significant impact on the so-called drivers of migration and can help people migrate by choice and not by force. Thanks.
Thank you, David, for that. And I think, I think the way you've started is really something maybe we should have already kind of discussed and covered in the webinar. It's the whole notion of, that the whole idea is to eliminate the adverse drivers, but not to eliminate migration. And highlighting, the positive contributions of migration is actually absolutely essential, even when we start a conversation about drivers. So thank you for starting with that. And I mean, just gathering from what you've said, it's not access to jobs, it's the kind of jobs that people have, it's the kind of social security, it's all these things that are really, need to look at when we look at drivers. Let me ask you this, and I think this is a question that must be, people must be thinking about. We are in a situation of COVID. We are in a situation of an economic recession. We are in a situation where many migrants are returning back home to, uncertain times, uncertain prospects. From your experience, both at UNDP, but also, OECD and your previous kind of work in this, do you think we will witness a, situation where we have even more of these classical drivers that we're talking about, or even new drivers for migration? And is there something specific within the context of COVID for us to look at?
Thanks, Rula. It's a very good question, actually. We really don't know what is going to happen. As you know, most countries in the world have closed their borders. I'm pretty concerned about what is going to happen in the next months or years. I think that some countries are going to seize this opportunity to maintain some border restrictions. So it's likely that the world post-COVID will be even more closed, if that's possible, than the world pre-COVID. So what does it mean in terms of drivers of migration? That means that lots of people, even those willing to migrate, will have more difficulties, and it's even more challenge for forced migration and people not willing to migrate but still compelled to migrate, because they are going to migrate in worse conditions. These more restrictive policies imply that there will be people will endanger their lives to migrate, and that also implies probably that we will have more south-south migration flows, or more migration between developing countries, because it's going to be even more difficult to migrate towards high-income countries. So this, in terms of the conditions of migration, because of more restrictive migration policies. And on the other hand, because of this huge economic crisis we have everywhere in the world, and it's also not something that is going to finish in 2 months or in 3 months, we know that the current recession is going to have long-term effects. Obviously, there will be more reasons to migrate. So you are going to have, on the one hand, more people who will need to migrate because of the economic conditions, in particular in the countries where you don't have social safety nets, and I insisted on the importance of these social safety nets. More reason to migrate from all these countries, in particular in the developing world, and on the other hand, more restrictions to migration. So that might be a very, very difficult situation, and not very encouraging, let's say, for the future. So we should have more irregular migrants in the next months/years because of this condition, and more forced migrants and more people migrating in bad conditions. So that implies that if we don't find a way to have more cooperation, and that some people in high-income countries accept to receive migrants in good conditions with legal pathways, this is not very encouraging.
Thank you, David. And it's it's a gloomy picture in the sense of what will happen in the next few months as we continue to think about drivers. But maybe it's also really a way to think of the urgency of the situation and how important it is to act on some of these things we've identified. In a way, your answer about the more dangerous conditions that we might see is actually the perfect segue to our next speaker, Shamim. And I mean, maybe Shamim, you can help us get an idea of the situation on the ground. Obviously, the recruitment business is at the forefront of how people move. It's at the forefront of when people want to leave, when they are pushed or driven to leave their countries of origin. More often than not, their first point of contact is with a recruitment agent or a sub-agent, and then from there, that's where the migration journey starts for many. So maybe you can help us identify some of these, first, hands-on drivers that maybe Vivian, the micro-level drivers that maybe Vivian talked about previously. Why do people come to recruitment agencies? What are the reasons for them to come to recruitment agencies? This is the first part of the question. And maybe the second part of the question, can we think about what are some of the ways to ensure that migrant workers' rights are protected throughout all stages of the migration journey, and what is the role of the recruitment industry as such in that kind of endeavor? Drawing on what David said as well, that probably we will see more dangerous conditions for migrants going forward. How can we think about that as well? So to you, Shamim.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Amade. This is, first of all, I would like to thank you all giving me the opportunity and inviting me for this webinar. This is excellent work you are doing. I'm following this since you have started. This is a wonderful way. Can you hear me? Is it clear to that?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, thank you very much. So thanks to all the previous speakers. They have already said about the diverse, about the GCM to what we are talking about. Regarding the migration, you said that how the recruiting agency, the industry is, what is the role of the industry here and what exactly we are doing. You see, a country like us, if I'm talking about Bangladesh, right? So this is a huge number of population we have in our country. So it is quite difficult for us to employ this number of people, as overpopulated we are, and is a poverty, not sufficient job available. So people are willing to move to the other destination country where for the better living, for the financial benefit. So now, when we started, in our country, we said that started in 1978. Now you see, every year, almost 700,000 to 800,000 people are joining in the overseas employment. And it's a regular goal. Last 5 years data, if you see, you will find that. And how they contribute to our economy, this is more than 11 million Bangladeshi migrants are working in 171 countries. Yearly migration from Bangladesh is around 7 to 8 million. And overseas employment last year, it was 734,000 in 2018, and 2019 it was 711,000. And you see the remittance in 2018 and 19 US dollar 16.4 billion, right? And the GDP is 7% is contributed by the migrant, and which is 6 times of the OD of us and 11 times of FDI. So this is a picture where the migrants are contributing to our national economy. So this is a huge contribution to our national economy by the migrant workers. So now the recruiting industry is helping these people to get their job abroad. Initially, we have only 50 to 100 recruiting agencies. Now we have almost as part of 1,500 recruiting agencies in Bangladesh. They are all member of BIRA. Bangladesh Association of International Recruiting is the only association for the recruiting agency of is endorsed by the Bangladesh government, and this total number we have now. You can see how the recruiting industry has grown in last few decades because of the necessity of the volume of the people are joining in the overseas market. So considering this fact, we are working very hard, and recruiting has got a lot of responsibilities to help this people who are coming for the foreign employment. You see, what we are talking about, that if you talk how the employment country is the biggest challenge for us. And presently, if you see, and our market is mostly in Middle East, and if you see this, about 700,000 people are traveling every year. Out of them, almost 85%, you can say, it's a Middle Eastern country are receiving our workers. So this is one area that we need to come from the Middle Eastern side. We need to look for the other countries to employ our workers. So this industry is helping these people to travel a regular way, in regular migration we call. And migration is kind of two type of migration. Our workers is going for the short-term migration. So this is for the employment, like they're for the contractual basis, 2 years to 3 years and 5 years time. So this is a short-term migration, we said. And these people as contributing a lot to the nation, and their employment opportunities, which is not available here. They're looking for the better option. That's why these people are traveling abroad. Now, we talk about the GCM, the drivers too, which is clearly said that the people need to work in their country of origin. But they become the country like Bangladesh and other, we call it GCM, this is called Colombo Process Member States countries. So if you see all the sending countries and look at their population, like Philippines, Bangladesh, Indonesia, Pakistan, India, if you talk about all these countries, so you see it's a huge number of countries completely depend on the foreign migration. So because of the overpopulation and people need to go abroad. So this is, which is quite challenging for the recruiting agencies, industries to move with these migrant workers and to secure their healthy employment, overseas employment, the job site, security and safety, and healthy atmosphere in the job site, which is very important to keeping the human rights updated, keeping the other facilities intact. It is quite challenging for us because, you know, this in this process we have two countries involved in it, sending and the destination countries. So we have a lot of challenges between these two countries. So every country has got a different guideline, different policy guidelines. So this is a very, very tough task for the country like us to sending workers in the destination country with to maintaining their law and all. So we need to develop our workers' mental and physical fitness and their technical know-how, that the job he or she is going to obtain over there, she should be trained well so that the employer is getting benefited by her or him, and also he can benefit it. You see the recruiting industry, what they are doing, the workers, we have unemployment, you have the unemployment people. So we are helping these people to go abroad for a better opportunities. So this way, the employment country, the employer also getting a support. It's a win-win situation for both, for the employment country employers and the country like us, that we have overpopulated people, and we are helping these people to get job over there. So we are working as a bridge in between us. And what you have said, that they are not coming to us directly. There is a middleman issues. There is some other way. Well, this is we are working very hard with the government of country and our Ministry of Expatriate, that how we can develop a system so that the people are aspirant migrants can join us directly to the recruiters, so that their in the recruitment process, whatever the bottleneck we have, we can reduce those issues. So which you know, that's quite challenging task. If 700 to 800,000 people are traveling, joining overseas market, so it is not a small task to protect all the workers' rights in the destination country. So we are working very, very hard on that, so that how we can make it more ethical, more safer. This we need to work, and we are working very hard on that. So for this second question, you said that shall I come later on, or you want to hear it from now?
I mean, maybe just to follow up on some of the things you said, because I've noticed there's an interesting kind of I'm not going to say contradiction, but I think I'm hearing two different things. On the one hand, I'm hearing, you know, in Bangladesh, the situation is as such that there is overpopulation, there is, you know, there's not enough jobs and all of this. And then from what David was saying, it's not necessarily the poorest of the poor. Maybe can we just, you know, dig down into the profile of people who come to recruitment agencies. And then I've noticed there is also kind of in the chat, as we were discussing, a question that is really asking about recruitment fees in Bangladesh and the high cost to migrants. And I think these are two issues that are somewhat connected. So if it's not the poorest of the poor, is it the people who are able to kind of afford these kinds of recruitment fees? And why is this still a problem today?
Well, this is one of the very important questions that we have to face everywhere, because you see, migration, overseas employment cannot be free. Overseas employment, that has an expenditure. So in the overseas, we are being a service provider, we are living on that, and we are earning through this. So we have two challenges. We have to do the social activities, and simultaneously we have to survive by ourselves. So what is happening about the migration costs? Because of there is a way that when the people are traveling abroad, so they need to bear the migration, the overseas employment cost, which is supposed to be borne by the employer. But some of the countries are not, the employer is not bearing it, so it has to be borne by the employee. So that's why this thing is coming up. And regarding the migration cost, what you have said, that compared to the other sending country, our migration is comparatively pretty high. What you have mentioned, I believe. So there is a numerous reason and numerous fact on it. So number one, the supply and demand, because we have almost 100,000 people are joining in the job market. Out of that, we have a demand of 700,000 or 800,000. So less than 50% we can provide job. So that is one thing. Another is that we talk about the middlemen in both countries, in the destination country and in the receiving end. There is a middleman over there. But considering we are working on it, how to reduce the migration costs. So we have requested and proposed to our ministry to develop a database system. We call it a central database system, so that the aspirant migrants can register themselves and online to that system. And whenever the recruiting agency has a demand, they can place those demand to our expert ministry. So then authority will provide us the data of the workers. Accordingly, we can select those workers. After selecting them, we will send a final list to the government, the authority, and whatever the financial we call is a placement fees is declared and is fixed by our authority. So this money will come through the bank, which is now it's all the process is manual. So we have proposed that if the system is developed and if all the transaction can go through the bank, then the migrants will suffer less, and the extra money where they are paying in different places, they are not being required to pay that. So we are very much cautious on that, and we are working on the issues, and hopefully it will be addressed very soon. And already it is working, and BIDA is working on these issues very, very hard. Any other other issues there to?
Thank you, Shamim, for this intervention, and I see there are already lots of questions for you in the chat, especially on recruitment fees and all of that. So we will come back to this at a later point. I mean, I just wanted to. I think it's been already a very interesting debate, and I want to go back a little bit to Professor Bellow, if you're still with us. And I think it's been interesting to hear your argument, but also to hear Vivian and David after that, because I think there is a bit of contrast between what you are talking about in terms of the role of trade policies, the role of the global economic system in causing displacement and migration and all of that, and what, for instance, Vivian and David were talking about in terms of more individual, smaller kinds of drivers. So I would just like to come back to you to ask, do you think it is an either-or kind of conversation, or is it more of a both kinds of drivers at the same time? And is there, in terms of, because we are trying to be as actionable as possible in terms of looking at drivers and minimizing drivers, how do we prioritize and where do we move first?
Well, I hope it's not a semantic question. Of course, every human move is a move by choice, okay? Even lifting my finger, et cetera, et cetera. But I guess what we're saying is, that choice is conditioned by one's context. And if one's context is tremendous poverty and suffering, then it's very understandable why people choose to migrate. So I think that looking at this micro stuff, I mean, it's important, but I think we really should pay attention to the big structural factors that creates this massive movements of people abroad. And a structural adjustment pushed by the World Bank and the IMF has just created tremendous crisis of inequality and poverty. I think nobody disputes that at this point, except crazy neoliberals. And trade liberalization, which was promoted by the World Trade Organization, converted so many countries that had been self-sufficient in terms of agricultural production because of tariff liberalization and massive imports coming in. They became basically import-dependent economies with huge swaths of agriculture destroyed, forcing farmers, in fact, in the case of Mexico, is very exemplary with the advent of US corn to, in fact, migrate. So in essence, if we're going to move away from the crazy semantics of these things, people had no choice because of the way that structural factors really impinge on them. So that in that sense, there was really no choice but to go abroad. So sure, let's study the micro stuff, but to put that as sort of the key rather than the structural factors is something that's, how would you put it now, academically illegitimate. Let's just put it that way.
Thank you for that, Professor Bellow. And I mean, we've talked a little bit about addressing the micro stuff, but if we want to talk in a macro sense, how do we address these kind of bigger questions?
Oh, well, I think we really should put an end to the kind of trade and financial liberalization that has been identified as the key causes of growing inequality in the world today. The growth of the 1%, the fact that the middle class has been moving down, and the conditions of people who are poor is in fact even worsening. So, I think that it's indisputable at this point that liberalization of trade, liberalization of capital flows has created tremendous poverty, tremendous inequality, and tremendous instability in economies. So I think we really need a rebooting of the way that structures, economic structures, are created and maintained. So my sense is that we really need to move away from these programs, which has been imposed by the IMF and the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank, for Christ's sake, which has been so destructive of the lives of people. And we really need policies that promote equality, that promote equity, that promote the value of community and ownership. So, it's these kinds of structural reforms that are very much needed at this point. And sure, let's do some micro studies, but let's not put them at the center of things.
Thank you, Professor Bellow. I think one question that comes to the mind of everybody, just as a follow-up to what you are saying, in the context of COVID, how possible is rebooting the system? Is it an opportunity or is it an added challenge?
Well, I think that one of the problems of globalization and neoliberalism and the whole worship of connectivity has, in fact, been the creation of this global supply chains, whether it's in industry and agriculture, and that have, in fact, been so destructive of local and national economies. And with the crisis of global supply chains at this point in time, here is an opportunity to be able to revive local economies, revive local agriculture. And, we're talking about, in Southeast Asia and China, for instance, 50% of agricultural consumption at this point is filled by not local, but global and regional supply chains. And it's becoming the same in Latin America and in parts of Africa and in India. So what we're seeing is that this globalized economy has been so destructive, and with the barriers being created by COVID-19, here are possibilities now of restructuring back to the local, and restructuring back to the local and emphasizing production that is not just policies that do not just promote local production, but also good income distribution. Peasant organizations like Via Campesina, for instance, have been promoting this. So the opportunities for localizing production back and ending these tremendous flows of people from the countryside to the cities and from the cities to abroad, this can in fact be a silver lining of COVID-19. COVID-19 is of course terrible, but at the same time, it does create some possibilities for recreating economies at this point in time. And as I mentioned earlier, one of the big problems about migration, while I don't think we should put up barriers to migration, but one of the things that it has created in places like the Philippines has been that the elites basically have encouraged it because it reduces the pressure for systemic change within the country. So, and I think that's the same in so many other countries, that it's seen as a safety valve that moves, that eliminates the need for the elites to create, structures of equality and democratic participation. So I'm just saying that COVID is bad, but then it also offers opportunities for change that hopefully we can seize.
I think, I mean, in a way, it was very striking with COVID and how at the beginning there were so many supply chains that were interrupted. And I think maybe that also triggers the thinking of how can we do this differently. So let's sure hope, Professor Bellow, that this would be a window of hope into thinking about how can we do this together and how can we reduce inequalities both globally, but also inequalities that, you know, within people in the same country. So let's share your hope for that. Thank you very much for that. Let's go to you, Bijaya. And I know so far the issue of you know, women and the issue of you know, the social drivers and the whole question of gender inequality also as you know, as a driver for migration is very relevant today. And I think we are now starting to understand more and more into depth, you know, how social structures also can push women to migrate. And sometimes there are also stigmas associated with women's migration. It's not just, you know, on the whole question of pushing women to migrate, but also on sometimes not even, you know, saying the kinds of occupations women are migrating to because of social stigma and all of these kinds of, you know, unequal, if we can say, you know, discriminations that women face. So I think, can you help us understand in the context of women migrant workers, how can we look at drivers and how can we look at rights and dignity in the migration journey?
Hi, thank you, Rola. Because as a returning women migrant worker myself, and working in this issue for nearly 2 decades, you know, I totally agree with Viviana, who was saying that, you know, migration, you know, it's a drivers of migration is not new. You know, it's been like women, the push and pull factor, the drivers are not new. It's, you know, you can see, I would like to start by saying that migration has never been a choice for women, especially women migrant workers. And always it's that women are traveling as in informal sectors. Why women always have to travel in informal sectors, right? When I started working this issue nearly 2 decades ago, you know, there was a ban for women migrant workers. And I can see that not only in Nepal, but over in all the country of origin. Like, of course, Philippines is a country, it's an exemplary country for all of us, for countries of origin like us. But still, there are so many problems for women migrant workers. So I say that, you know, migration, the push and pull factor, the drivers is not new. But however, you know, after all this after many years, the trend has changed, right? Trend has changed. Before, women migrant workers used to migrate without knowing, without any knowledge. You know, any knowledge. And in our country, in Nepal, and especially I can see not only Nepal, in Bangladesh, India, and even like Philippines, Indonesia, you see women, you know, because of the illiteracy, they are more vulnerable to being trafficked, you know, and unsafe migration. They are being lured, they are easily being lured. And the reason why is in most of the countries, it's poverty, right? And the other, the drivers is always say it's domestic violence. And that is why they try to escape the domestic violence. They try to escape poverty. They want to educate their children in a good school. They want to give a good life to their family. So these are the drivers. And the other is unemployment. In most countries, like because they're not educated, they cannot get a job. And if they want to work in their own land, they don't have a land also, enough land to do agricultural work. So these are the drivers, you know, and the trend, you know, before I say, we are saying that most of these women, they were forced to migrate, they were lured, they were trafficked. But now the trend has changed. Even educated girls, educated young girls, not only women, but educated young women, girls also migrate because they don't have any choice here. They don't have any choice. And they are easily, you know, like lured by traffickers, even by recruitment agencies. So these are the trends. And the other thing is, it's in our country, and even in Sri Lanka, I can hear in Bangladesh, the ban, our government there is so easily putting this, you know, imposing this ban, saying, oh, this is to protect women, right? Protect women. and curtailing our mobility. We don't have mobility, right to mobility. And that ban, if the ban is there and women are not able to migrate through legal channel, go through the pre-departure orientation, go through legal channel, but they are trafficked by traffickers, because we in Nepal, we have an open border to India, and they are easily lured from India and they're trafficked into the Gulf, most of them into the Gulf countries. So this ban has been there since 1998, the off and on ban. In 1998, there was a ban. And again, it was lifted. We, civil societies, we women activists, we advocated, we worked with the government, and the ban was lifted. And again, in 2009, there's a ban to go to Lebanon, and that ban is still there. But when we see there in Lebanon, look at Lebanon. There are so many women migrant workers, Nepali women migrant working in Lebanon. Where is the ban? And the other thing is the ban. And then in 2012, again, age ban. It was there in Sri Lanka, and then it came to Nepal also, age ban. Women had, can only travel after they are, when they reach 24 years old. 30 years old. But after our advocacy, after our lobbying with the government, it came out is into to up to 24 years old, right? So there are certain bans that is most challenging for us. And what we want from our government, not only Nepal, we can see in Bangladesh, India, all women migrant workers, the state has to come up with something. As just now, Mr. Bellow, I agree totally with him. He said that there should be economic structure, change in the economic structure of the states. Women, they are earning a small amount of money. The salary is so low. That money they can earn in our own country, living with our own family. But that that kind of job is also not available. Our governments are, look at this in this pandemic situation also. Our governments were not even prepared. Like as just now, Mr. Who was saying, I think David, he was saying that migration is going to be worse after this post-pandemic. Yes, it's going to be worse, because our governments are not at all prepared for this. There we have, our government has estimated that around 500,000 will be returning home, and they are not prepared. Our government is not prepared. I don't know the situation of other countries, but our government is not at all prepared. So people, even women, are asking us, said, when is the lockdown is going to ease? When we can travel again? They still want to migrate. So this is going to be worse, because for us in Nepal, the ban is still there. And what we want with our government is not big thing. We want our government to create job opportunities for us. Maybe it's not, as Mr. Shamin said, it's not possible in Bangladesh because of the huge population. But I think it's possible in Nepal. We don't have a big population, but in Nepal, our governments can. Our government has to have bilateral agreement with a country of destination also, because our migrant workers are not only working, not contributing only to the country of origin, they are also contributing to the country of destination. So our government has to work with the country, the government of the country of destination, if they really want the safety and security of migrant workers. And why is always informal sector? Why is there discrimination? I don't know why this word is there, informal and formal sector, and always women are there in the informal sector. So why is this discrimination always be there? So and I also agree with Mr. Samin that the status of the formal and informal sector and the choice. Migration has never been a choice. So so what we want our government is to create job opportunities. And even in this COVID situation, there should not be discrimination. I don't know what is there in other countries, but in our country, women, they are stigmatized because even the community, they are not prepared to accept migrant workers. They think that migrant workers are carriers of corona. So they are, they are stigmatized. We have to do a lot of awareness, for organization like us also. We are, supporting them with shelter services. And when we try to, unite them with their family in the community, it's a very challenging thing, because some of the communities are not ready to accept them, even if they are carrying a PCR negative test result in their hand. So these are some challenges that we are facing. Rula, maybe more later. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you, Vijaya. And I think you're one of the few to point out as well. The government responsibility in all of this. I think we often forget about this because when we're talking about ensuring migration and rights in migration, we always forget to ask about what conditions are governments also providing for people back at home. So thank you very much for highlighting this and also for focusing on women-specific issues. From here, I think we're looking at this from a sectoral lens now, and I think it's as we do so, I think it's important to also look at the other side of this, which is really related to climate change and even the inclusion of references to climate change in the text of the Global Compact was a hard-fought battle, if I can say. And I think this is true for civil society, but also true for governments who particularly suffer from climate change. And then we have with us Kylie, and Kylie, you've worked quite a lot on the issue of climate change and climate-induced migration. And I was wondering if you can share with us some of the challenges that you are seeing in the next couple of months, or even on a longer-term perspective, with regards to climate change and migration and climate change induced migration. And then as we look at the review process, how can we look at that as a way of identifying and moving forward on some of these challenges we're facing today?
Yeah, thank you, Rula. You rightly pointed out that climate change being included in the GCM is quite novel. And quite bold for any sort of global compact, some more than others, and I won't name the others. But I feel very privileged to be here to be a part of this panel, and that for climate change to give the same sort of standing as other drivers of migration. I think it's been pointed out by many speakers that the conversation about drivers is not new, but I think engagement with climate change as a major driver of migration is relatively new. And I think that is important, and it speaks to the point we're in today. And that is that one of the challenges actually is ensuring that climate change isn't just seen as kind of a tertiary issue, a niche issue, that those that live, work, and breathe on this issue, like myself, aren't the only ones that are interested in it or see it as a legitimate driver of migration in some cases. Now, huge caveat, climate change is never kind of the only driver of migration. But it plays a role certainly in exacerbating existing vulnerabilities and kind of the ability to overcome any sort of shocks to livelihoods, for instance. And I actually want to put this into context today because climate change is not some sort of future crisis. It's happening now, it's happening today. We see at this very moment, large parts of South Asia underwater, including over a third of Bangladesh. The number of named storms in the Atlantic hurricane season being higher than ever before and mounting. The wildfire season in California is occurring earlier than ever before, and it's more intense than ever before. We see locusts and massive flooding also in the Horn of Africa and East Africa that are wreaking havoc. So that is to say that climate change is a factor in everyday people's lives today. And also there might be, limits to adaptation in place, adaptation in situ. So, objective 2 is very clear about talking about investment in climate change adaptation and resilience, disaster risk reduction. And I think that's important. It's always a first order of business to allow people to actually have as much agency as possible to make the choice to stay in their places of origin and not have to migrate if they don't have to. But I think what we're seeing and what climate scientists are telling us is that there may be limits to that sort of investment. And so I think this also necessarily means that objective 2 and its components cannot be kind of separated and siloed from other discussions, including about available, safe, and just pathways for decent work, for example, and those things outlined by objective 5 within the compact. And so that's kind of one set of challenges, I think, is really seeing climate change as something that's not a niche issue. The second challenge would be COVID-19, and other speakers have mentioned this before. COVID-19 has laid bare the persistent complexity and interconnection between climate change and migration issues, actually. So if we take the case of India, COVID-19 and subsequent lockdowns really hit migrant workers' livelihoods the hardest. Those that are working in the informal economy in cities in particular, who were left without any support, especially economic support and economic assistance, forcing them to walk thousands of miles back home, essentially, to their places of origin. In some cases, in particular in the Sundarbans, for instance, that meant that these migrants were put right in the path of Cyclone Amphan. And so I'm currently writing a report with RI that looks at these issues, and it finds that, these returned migrant workers are left in even more precarious situations than usual because of COVID-19. They don't have access to kind of economic lifelines as they once would. They aren't able to send back remittances to families to help them build back. And, they find that Cyclone Amphan, although, was not as destructive or didn't have such a high death toll, it did really do a number on croplands there. In both Bangladesh and India, actually, where some fields are salinized beyond repair for 3 to 5 years. So this is really kind of a long-term issue for those who are living on the edge. COVID-19 has also meant border closures, as everyone has mentioned, restrictions on mobility, and even kind of impact on much needed progress related to regional integration and freedom of movement. Freedom of movement is especially important post-disaster, and mechanisms like the Platform on Disaster Displacement have shown that it's really a successful way in which we can get regions to cooperate together to allow people to seek safety across borders post-disaster. So COVID-19 has implications for this sort of progress. It also affects kind of bottom lines and budgets, and it diverts attention away from climate change adaptation and resilience measures, even though we know that these measures are essential to ensure that people have the choice whether or not to migrate. And we also know that we must build back better or greener in the face of kind of a COVID-19 disaster. But this also leads to the next challenge, which is kind of coherence between migration and climate change policy, especially for the people who are being affected on the ground. So we use India as one example. But we also can reference Build Back Better again. If we ask who are we building back better for and on the backs of whom, then we start thinking, or we start seeing that the intersections of climate change policy and migration policy are not so disconnected, right? For example, in the US, Building Back Better means often having migrant workers come in and aiding in the construction industry. And this is not just relegated to the US. I also worked a lot in Thailand, or did research in Thailand, and this is par for the course. The construction industry is largely supported by migrant workers, right? And so, these are some things, the ways in which climate change and migration issues intersect, and the ways in which we're not really talking about them. On the positive side, the GCM in particular and the reviews could help to bridge this gap. Can we interest those who might just be interested in migrants' rights or development and economics with more broad discussions about upstream climate change, environment issues and policies. And that would be also, of course, up to civil society to push policymakers on this. And there's a lot of things that we can do, for instance. So I'm part of also the Climate Change, Migration, and Displacement platform. And we will be, for example, undertaking a scan of all ongoing initiatives. They may not be explicitly framed as contributions to GCM implementation, and to bring them into kind of the GCM review fold. And hopefully this can support ideas for how to create action, identify any sort of champions or stakeholders that are working on this, and show and tell how what they're doing is applicable. And get some concrete steps towards implementation. So that's just kind of a brief reflection, and I'll throw it back to you, to Rula, to moderate the rest of the discussion. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Kylie. And I think you've really kind of explained the connection so well between climate change and migration, and how the two worlds also intersect, and how do we begin these kinds of conversations, which are as you say, still very new. I would like to come back to you at some point, and I think maybe we can come back to the whole, climate change and gender kind of, sectoral lenses more and more and explore these in depth. But I will hold for a second now, and I want to come back to Vivian, actually, after we've heard from Professor Waldo, and I think I've kind of asked David this question, but I want to ask it to you, Vivian. I think, from Professor Bellow, we've heard a little bit about how there could be a possibility to reboot some of these, systems, and with it to impact these kinds of drivers. Do you think, in terms of the drivers that you have covered, or the way of looking at drivers from, a micro kind of perspective, is COVID-19 a possibility to do this through rebooting that Professor Bellow have talked about?
Thank you. Is COVID-19 the time to do this? I think it cannot be generalized. So needs to be looked at maybe more from even regional. I find a bit difficult, but more from country to country. Yes, I think this is actually the time for structural changes. Absolutely. I'm not sure if many governments are ready for that. What we see is that a lot of action is taken at the moment, but not properly well thought through. In addition, we also see a lot of pushback from certain communities within countries, which is not always leading to positive effects. On the other hand, I think what's also a little bit missing here, I'm very happy that the climate change angle is provided here. That is super important. So that's often what we in IOM put also a bit on the natural disaster, displacement, forced displacement. So I think the two elements of conflicts and natural causes of migration need to be put into the equation of economic structural reform, because both of them play a very important role to actually address drivers. So only bringing structural change, and we see it in some parts of the world already happening, and it will get worse from my personal point of view, not the IOM point of view. I don't think it's enough, because many of those things need time and a lot of action, which is taken right now, and this is really my personal view, is being done to quickly fill gaps and holes, to just move on and to keep things a bit stable. So I hope so. I think with various economies even further downgrading, it should happen, but I'm not certain, unfortunately.
Thank you, Vivian. Kylie, can I go back to you? And I think Bijaya spoke about government responsibility, right? From when you talk about climate change, how can we look at what is government responsibility there?
I mean, obviously, there's different perspectives on this. I mean, if we're talking from a pure climate perspective, it's really up to government policy to ensure that mitigation is really a central part of sustainable futures, right? We can't talk about climate change impacts without trying to hedge those impacts first. But it's also up to government to invest and think thoroughly through climate change adaptation and resilience measures, but also to include migration within that discussion, and to figure out ways in which migrants' rights and migrants' pathways to moving in a safe and just manner as a part of that. But it's often also not just up to national governments, but also kind of regional mechanisms, because part of that movement needs to happen across borders. We have to be realistic about what kind of limits to adaptation there are within borders and what that means then for some more kind of proactive or bold measures. Vivian rightly noted, though, that just because governments should be responsible for something doesn't mean that they will be responsible for it. So I just want to be a little bit more realist about, what we're requesting and what we think should happen versus what might possibly happen in the future.
Thank you so much, Kylie. And I think now we're like half an hour before our webinar concludes. So what I would like to do is take a few comments from the floor, and I see some people have already asked to speak, and some other people have put some questions in the chat box. So we'll do this for a while, if I can ask first William Goyce from Migrant Forum in Asia to do a short comment from the floor, followed by Shabri Nair from the ILO, and also I see Paddy has also posted a question in the chat box. Maybe we can pick on this, Paddy. But can we start with you, William?
Yeah, sure. Sure. Thanks, Rola, and thanks for what I think has been a very, very interesting debate, and I think it has also been very provocative. And I'm wondering what is the disconnect. And I like the way Walden has started with looking at the structural and systemic issues that we need to deal with, which have led to a lot of the social issues that we currently have and are dealing with. And one of the challenges is migration, which seems to be a result of some of these structural inequalities that Walden has raised. And at the same time, I hear David and Vivian and looking at trying to manage with this kind of outflow of people and addressing migration challenges within that context. And then when you look at it within the COVID context, it's interesting that you really have to go back to the fundamentals and what Walden has said. And I think the COVID has once again brought out this situation of the disproportionate kind of the inequalities in our world, and how developing countries at least will be impacted more or have been impacted more. And to further lend to his argument, it's very interesting also because when you look at all that has been put in place in terms of migration governance by the UN system, GCM, and all this kind of processes that have been put in place, very little of that had an uptake during this period of the pandemic. There was no immediate, recourse to this kind of systems. The systems actually fell apart. The regional consultative processes, bilateral agreements, international frameworks, all this kind of fell apart as countries responded in a very ad hoc, like Vivian says, reactionary way sometimes to a lot of the situation without reflection, at the risk of leaving migrants stranded and abandoned in many, many situations. And we've seen the context where migrants from heroes went down to zeros as vectors of the disease, carrying the stigma and things like that. So I think some of what Kylie and Vijaya and Walden have been saying is to look at some of the kind of systemic issues that we need to look at, even as we then try to manage them through kind of programs or that try in a certain way to address this. But then I would come back to Walden and ask Walden, but while you say that there is hope in the recovery from COVID, the challenge is that many developing countries have already borrowed heavily to address COVID. And so are we not in the danger of everything that you are saying just being reinforced even more strongly in the current context as we think of recovering? Unless, of course, there is a fantastic debt cancellation and forgiveness and things like that. We are in a worse mess in the developing world now because of what we have taken on in response to COVID or in dealing with COVID than we were prior to, or maybe just exasperated even that situation even more. Thank you.
Well, thank you, William. And let me just say that definitely we really need the international agencies at this point, especially those that deal with finance, to really have a kind of a Marshall Plan of, resources that can go to those countries, to developing countries, to countries in the South that they really do not have the capabilities of dealing with COVID. I think that there should also be really massive cancellation of debt and debt forgiveness at this point, so that resources that would otherwise go to servicing the debt would go to servicing people, especially both the public health as well as the economic impacts of COVID. So, what we have this international system at this point in time, and especially the United Nations, parts of those systems should really respond to this situation. But as for the IMF, the World Bank, and the regional development agencies, this is the time by which they can work to erase the blot of their really bad policies in the past by really accelerating fund transfer to the global South. Having said that, all I was really saying is, that globalization has been so destructive of local economies, and what is happening is precisely that because of the breakdown of global supply chains, which have been dominated by transnational corporations, here is an opportunity to relocalize industrial production, to relocalize agricultural production, and not only relocalize them, but make sure that they are accompanied by policies of equity. So it's not like this is something new that I'm saying. Organizations like Via Campesina, peasant organizations like Via Campesina and others have been over the last 25 years saying that we really need to stop this globalization of production that has destroyed local economies and relocalize. So all I'm trying to say is that COVID, terrible as it is, does have some silver lining. And this is the possibilities for relocalization of production at this point in time. So again, I will just like to make those 2 points. One is a big Marshall Plan of debt cancellation plus channeling of resources to the global South at this point in time. And to take the opportunity offered by COVID, bad as it is, nevertheless to take that silver lining to relocalize production owing to the breakdown of global supply chains. So that's all I was saying.
Thank you, Professor Bellow. Let's take two more comments for now. Shabri, are you there? And then followed by Paddy, and after that, just to see Evelyn Tennant and Manfred Bergman. Manfred, in case you want to make an intervention as well. But let's take Shabri for now.
Thanks a lot, Rola. And what a pleasure it is to listen to Walden Bellow. Sir, Walden, I've always appreciated the wisdom with which you come into these conversations, and I've really learned a lot. And I'm glad, like William pointed out, you're speaking about these broad structures, and that's what we need to address. If you look at the broad structures, one of the things that we're so struck by in South Asia, and Walden, I'll never be able to equal you in the thinking of, let's say, the neoliberal values that is spreading across the world like a pandemic, but more in terms of what we see here in South Asia, as an example. In South Asia, we see a strong, very strong competition between countries. Just because the pandemic has hit has not reduced the competition, and the competition is leading to adverse drivers of migration. And that is something that we need to look more closely at. Bijaya spoke about the responsibility of government, but how do you expect a government to be responsible when they're looking for labor markets elsewhere, when they're not able to create jobs in their own countries? Aspirations, and I think David nicely touched on it, not necessarily using the word aspiration, but I'm a big fan of aspiration. I think it is important for us to recognize, Walden, you said it very nicely when it comes to the fact that even if you lift a finger, it is your choice of wanting to lift that finger. So let us then consider aspiration as an important driver, and that is not wrong. And I liked David's thinking along those lines. In the number of countries that we visited, if we go to schools, communities where there are heavy migration communities, and we go to schools in those communities, the children are sitting next to children whose lunch boxes have been brought in by fathers who have come back from the Middle East. So they look at those lunch boxes and say, well, I want a lunch box like that, and then go back and talk to their parents about it. So the peer pressure along those lines. If you look at the neighbor's house and say, wow, well, that neighbor has a washing machine, I need one too. How am I going to have access to a washing machine? Remittances that contribute to big marriages in South Asia. Well, how am I going to have a big celebration for a marriage in my own house for my daughter or for my son? These are important factors. I really liked, Walden, you mentioned about the church hierarchy. Well, in countries in South Asia, we're also stuck with religious intolerance. We are struck with issues when it comes to caste divisions, for instance, and therefore people having to move as a result of these issues. One that keeps coming to my mind is the fact, if we look at objective 2 of the GCM, actionable commitment B of objective 2 talks about investing in programs that accelerate fulfillment of sustainable development goals. I won't read the whole thing, but it gives you a list of actions that they can commit to investing in. That basically means we need to start mainstreaming migration into development planning. A lot of conversation has been happening around these lines for the past 10 years, for the last decade, but there is no mainstreaming happening. That is because migration is still a fringe topic. It's still a topic considered to be for people who are along those fringes. Let us look at labor market needs. I come from India. In labor market needs, when we talk about labor market needs, they say here in India, if you throw a stone randomly across a road, the chances are that 90% of the time it will land on an engineer. So there are more engineers being produced in this country without necessarily understanding whether that is necessarily what this country needs in terms of labor market needs. And one final point, keeping in mind that there is this strong urge to focus on specific groups. I heard gender. Let us also not forget that youth are the big driving force. Any aspect of migration today is led by the youth. They are the ones who are desperately looking to leave. They are the ones who are desperately looking for those jobs. So I think there needs to be that strong youth perspective as well. But thanks so much. I've really enjoyed this conversation. Rula, back to you.
Thanks, Chabri. Paddy, are you with us?
Sorry, I was waiting to be unmuted.
Very good. We can hear you now.
Can you hear me? Okay.
Yes.
Great. Thank you, Rula, for asking me to speak. A few words. I think everything has been elaborated and spoken, and I'm just wary that we have quite a number of students who are joining us. Because this obviously forms part of the series of webinars that is attached to the Global Compact for Migration certificate program that is being offered by the 4 institutions that have also convened this webinar. And I think it's also very important to make the interconnections as we are going along. Looking at what we looked at last week when we talked about the role of data, we come to think about drivers and factors of migration and trying to understand how we can mitigate adverse impact of that. And I think a lot has been said. I really do agree that we have to look at the micro factors, whether we're looking at individual choices or group choices, that these are existing or whether they're in reaction to wider structural failures that are there in our societies from a societal point, from a social point of view, economic, climate related, environment, and that they affect communities. And when we talk about communities, I think we do realize that it cuts across gender, depending on what the nature of migration is or what opportunity sits on the other side. Youth, like Shabri has just mentioned, now children as well are joining a lot in these movements and understanding what are the kind of drivers to this. And also in some parts you still see quite the more, let's say, experienced that are also moving along. So we would say maybe the older generation that are moving along with this type of migration. And all this is happening obviously in different markets. And also because there's an opportunity on the other side for improved livelihoods at the end of the day, whether it's in an urban center, peri-urban center, or cross-border, as you will see in some parts. I'm meant to reflect a bit on the western part of Africa, where you have seen a lot of migration actually is very intra-regional, and therefore trying to understand this would require you to have a bit of a micro perspective. Sorry, can you hear me? I seem to see as though my video is going on and off. Can you hear me, Rula? Okay, you can.
Yes, we can still hear you.
Okay, yeah. So speaking about the importance of us really looking at different drivers, it's really about the context. Geographical context is also very important, the societal context, and I think all the many other factors that are happening around this population that's making the move. And therefore, some of the questions that I've asked, I think, are very much related to this. And
Paddy? I think we've lost you. I think we've lost you, Paddy, but we'll try to come back to you later on if your connection works again. Sorry about that. Manfred, are you with us? Would you like to come in for a short intervention? I see you are here.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So I can tell you just a very deep contradiction that I see, and that this conference has well highlighted. The big contradiction is that during the COVID trauma, mass trauma, global trauma, there has been no significant change in international policies for protecting people. And these we can see also in the different programs and projects that are running. For example, in Europe, here we see people coming from some countries applying for asylum that never happened before. There is some increase of these. And then we have some people who are dying at the borders, actually, during the COVID age. And this policy, this border policy, is apparently justified with the necessity to prevent the nation from illegal entries of suspected COVID cases, while we know that COVID has many official channels. So this contradiction brings me, as an author of materials of orientation for pre-departure or integration handbooks for migrants and refugees, to ask them always to follow the legal channels for migration. While I know that most of them are not passing from legal channels, and they are desperately seeking the way to find valid documents after 5, 10, 15 years of clandestinity in my country, in my continent. So actually, there has been no regularization of undocumented migrants related to this crisis. Officially, we in Italy had a mass campaign of regularization. We expected to regularize between 200,000 and 500,000 people, but at the end we are regularizing just 70,000 people. So the rest of the people will remain undocumented. And in this hypocrisy, nothing changed actually. Only some possibilities that are open because of the crisis. That is some shifting jobs, like the domestic workers who were mostly coming from Bulgaria and Romania in Italy have been substituted with non-European domestic workers. And this trend is increasing actually. So you see that there is some change that bring also different flows. So what I want to say is that it is a very complex conference, the one of today, and I have to see it again once more for understanding some points of view, because it is full of different aspects. Me, from Europe, I see some increases of application of asylum from certain countries that are quite worrying, because it seems that people have more push factors behind them, and that this migration is not completely volunteer. There is some problem of big pressures for a crisis that is also economical.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Manfred, for this intervention. I will take a final short intervention by Professor Kadria. If you are there, we always go back to you.
Me unmute. Yeah, I'm unmuted. Thank you, Raula. It has been a very enriching session on the second objective in terms of looking at the drivers of migration. And that's where I think all that has been said is extremely relevant. And when that happens, then it becomes challenging to filter them out in terms of trying to look at them, what is extremely important now and what can wait for an action later on. Like Shabri had said that there is a list of actionable commitments and so on. So if we juxtapose all these drivers that have been addressed, whether they are man-made or they are, over time they have become natural drivers of migration, or they are still man-made drivers of migration, we need to put them in a time scale in terms of what action should be taken when. For example, I would say if children are affected, for example, then we may be warranted to take those actions immediately, because children, some of the crises that hit children cannot wait to be affected. On the other hand, systemic change, no matter how critical we are, that we are in an extremely unequal world, the change will come slowly. We begin today, but we cannot be extremely ambitious in terms of deriving the results tomorrow. We may have to wait for weeks and months and years. Yes, we have to begin, but at the same time, how much resources should go into them is very, very important. So I would say that what is important is to not only look at adverse drivers of migration, but also positive drivers of migration, which actually leads to development. So migration also leads to development. That we have to address them together, not put them into different boxes. That I think is important. And when it comes to time scale, we need to look at time scale, the lifeline of different stakeholders in migration. For example, as I said, children, but it's not only children, it's women, it's men, and it's individuals actually. So individuals' lifespan or elderly people, that needs to be taken into account when we are trying to address the drivers of migration from the point of view of the objective of minimizing them. We cannot be living in a fool's world of thinking that this would become zero. So from that point of view, I think the word minimizing is extremely important. That I think is we have to keep in mind, and that for that we need to have our priority scale. How much do we expect can be achieved in next 6 months? How much can be achieved in next 1 year? And through what mode of cooperation? Whether, like, it was India's example was given in terms of internal migration. Now, who takes the decision in those cases? Is it all the countries? Yes, countries can give aid, but ultimately the onus lies on unilateral action. That is where I think it is important to differentiate between unilateral actions or unilateral, minimization, or bilateral or multilateral, and so on. So I would like to say that from the point of view of this discussion, we need to address what is called counterintuitive. We can go on addressing things that we already know from time immemorial about migration, push-pull factors, this and that, but we need to narrow it down. And that narrowing down can take place from asking ourselves what is counterintuitive rather at this particular point in time, and this is an opportunity to put it in the light of the COVID-19 challenge, the COVID-19 opportunity. And I think all the speakers that have addressed and the commentators, William and Sabri and others, have highlighted that is what I find common, the common thread in all the presentations, all the points that have been raised. Thank you, Raul.
Thank you so much, Professor Kadria, for those reflections. Let us now come back to the panel. I'm very cognizant of time. I know we have 4 minutes left. So if we can take a final round of reflections, maybe 1 minute each, and then we can conclude this very rich discussion. Professor Bellow, can we start with you?
Yes. Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me to participate in the discussion. I also have found it very rich and challenging. I guess I would just like to say that one is the focus here has been on internal structural drivers of migration. And that is what I focused on. And I particularly have zeroed in on structural adjustment, trade liberalization, financial liberalization, and other neoliberal policies, because those, I think, have been the central ones. I do not mean to say there are no other drivers, but certainly these have been central drivers, and they have interacted with other drivers of migration to create, really what has been throughout the Global South, major internal crisis of the economies, comprehensive crisis of economies. And we've got to look at migration as a response to this comprehensive crisis of economies in the Global South. And I think that that's the first thing that I would just like to say. Now, the other part of the problem is, of course, what happens in the receiving countries, to use that term. And I think there it's fairly clear, that what we need is real change in policies so that migrants are accepted and given full and equal rights, because indeed, migrants do contribute, in a much, much greater way. We cannot just put it as a net positive, but definitely a very, very positive way to the culture, the social life, and the economies of these countries. So we need to look at those two factors coming together, that we really need both major structural reform in the sending countries and also major political reforms in the receiving countries. So I think those are the two main challenges when it comes to migration at this point in time. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Vivian, to you.
Thank you. Well, building up upon what Professor Bellow was just saying, just want to be short and to the point, and I mean, stressing again what I said, right? So let's try to get out of our comfortable box for those that really study migration theory. I want to use that for reform and change, and really start looking at the more multi-complex picture. And let's not forget that in general, the two key pillars, which are always there when people say, okay, these are the reasons why people migrate, which is either economic or it's forced. Let's really try to broaden up where I already said, like, okay, this discussion today is very much linked towards economic migration, but it's much more than that. So we touched upon climate change, and I again want to push also forced displacement or forced cross-border mobility. But what I said as well, it's not enough when you don't really look into the more micro level aspects around it. So besides the fact that it's about an individual, we need to really focus a lot on geography. So those that are imagined in their mind, emotional component of it, social relations, but also social obligations. And again, politics and power relations, either sending, let's not forget about transit and receiving countries. And again, the economic imperatives and the fact that displacement and formal migration really plays a role. Thank you.
Thank you, Vivian. David?
Yes, thank you, Rula. Thanks for this very, very interesting discussion. There is so much to say, so much to food for thought. I don't even know where to start. And just because of all the comments I have read in the chat, I just want to say I never said that everybody was migrating by choice. What I was saying is that we cannot decide from outside who is migrating by choice, who is migrating by force. This is my main concern, that we have to be careful as outsiders about deciding, oh, these people are migrating by force and we have to force them to stay home. Somehow it's switching a little bit the argument. So we have to be very careful in this respect. And that's what I wanted to say. And also I reiterate the fact that poverty is not a driver of migration. It's not the main driver of migration. Again, economic development is the main driver of migration. So that's very important. On all the discussion about the system, I mean, there is so much to say about all that. I think that, I mean, it's sometimes it's a little bit easy to blame the system and say, oh, we cannot do much because it's the system. And trade openness and financial openness has brought many development opportunities for many countries, and this can be denied. I mean, if we take the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, there has been a huge improvement in terms of poverty, in terms of child mortality, in terms of health. I mean, in so many indicators, we have improved the situation of millions of people around the world. So we cannot just blame the system. But it's true that for some countries and policymakers, it's easy to blame the system because that way you don't have to assume the responsibilities. And it's true that trade openness has brought many negative impacts. The problem is that countries haven't taken the necessary reforms, the labor market reforms to be to face this trade openness and the social safety nets. And we can see that with COVID-19 today, we have an issue because we don't have enough social safety nets. So we have to do that. And before we blame the system, and because it's going to take lots of time before we change all the structural things, we still need to work at the micro level. And for instance, this is what UNDP is doing. We are not a migration agency, we are a development agency. In somehow, all the work we are doing in the countries is to address the drivers of migration in terms of poverty, in terms of security, in terms of climate change. And with COVID-19, this is also what we need to do. We need to have recovery solution that improve access to social protection, who provides livelihoods, digital livelihoods, because lots of countries still have lockdowns. And this is the more pragmatic way to address this issue. So it's all interconnected. We need micro level, macro level, but because it's so difficult to change the international system, the macro system, then it's sometimes easier to start from the micro level, and this is the best way to act. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. We go now to Shamim.
Thank you, Rola. This is wonderful that what we are heard from our panelists and other speakers. You see, this COVID has, especially in the Southeastern countries, we are having a huge problem because of already from our sister from Nepal that described that the way the people are coming back, and rather we are sending more than country like us, we are sending more than 700,000 people abroad for the overseas employment. Since March, there is no movement, so all the border is closed. Rather, we are receiving workers from the destination countries, which is really a challenging for a country like us to face with these workers and their family. You see, they are totally traumatized because of they lost their job, they are financially crippled, and which is going to affect our socio-economic in the countries, which is the biggest challenge for us to address those issues. So we need the help of the international community that if now the destination country, because of the COVID, has given taking the toll of all the throughout the world that financially. So if the employers are start sending back the workers to our country, then it is a chaotic situation here. So we really do not know how we're going to handle it. And regarding what Mr. Sabri has said, that look at our country, we are not only sending people, we are becoming an employment country too. And yearly, almost you can say that about more than 600,000 people are working in our country, mostly from India and Sri Lanka and other countries, in RMG sector, in the hospital sector. So that means we have a job in our country. So what Sabri has said, that we need to restructure our educational system, because it has to be in need base. If you can, we can start and rethink about the revisit the site. So we need our own people. We are already hiring those people, those professionals from the abroad to run our industry. So if we can develop our people and train them, educated them on the need base, on the people we are looking for, then we don't need to depend on the foreign employment. You see, the money we are earning from the remittance from the migrant workers, almost more than 50% has been taken by the foreign workers from our country. So it is, we have to rethink about that, how we can de-employ our workers. Basically, our workers, those who have been migrated, those were lowest, low levels people, that's less educated people. So they are not finding enough job here. So that is the area we need to work on it. So how we can train these people and make them skilled, because Bangladesh also a lot of development work is going on. There's many mega project is on, and there is so the international people like Chinese and other people are coming and working on many projects. So if we can train this workforce for this kind of job, So we will be not dependent on the foreign employment, which is very important for us to look at these issues. And regarding the safety and security of our migrant workers, we are working very hard, and we need cooperation from the destination countries. They should adapt and change their policy as per the GCM objectives, as per the ILO convention. If those countries, the destination countries, to agree and to whatever they have signed, and they should make their political, the administrative change and the policy guideline change, which will protect the rights of our migrants workers, which is very important for us. The people are going abroad for their job. We need to protect their migrant, their rights, and we have to give them more facilities in the working place. These are the issues we need to work on it. And migration in both ways, it's helped the destination country and the sending country. Both the countries benefited by the migrant workers. So we need to think about that, how we can re-employ our workers here, and also we have to look for the overseas employment can be make more safer and more ethical. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity. I'm looking forward to get more support from all of your side and international community to make the migrants workers' life more easier and more safer. Stay safe.
Thank you.
Stay blessed.
Thank you, Shamim. Thank you for that. Vijaya, final thoughts, final quick thoughts?
Thank you, Rola. First of all, I would like to thank, of course, MFA and, of course, Rola for your excellent moderation, because this is a very big opportunity for us as a women migrant workers organization. And for this, before I end, I would like to stress a little bit about what Mr. Shamin has said about, okay, even Nepal is becoming a country of destination for countries. So we have Indian citizens working here from Bangladesh, from Sri Lanka. Yes, but the thing is, even Nepalis, they are working in Bangladesh. I think it's not the problem that they don't know how to, they don't have that kind of training, but it's dignity of work. Our women migrant workers, they are prepared to work as a domestic worker in a country of destination, but they are not prepared to work as a domestic worker here in our country because the dignity of work. Maybe we have to work more on dignity of work. Work cannot be big and small. It has to be dignified. The work has to be dignified. So I think we need to work on dignity of work, even all the country of origin, like India, Bangladesh, Nepal, we have to work on dignity of work. Even in construction work, Nepalese, they are, our migrant workers, they are working in Qatar in a construction sector, like in domestic sector, but they are not prepared to work in the construction sector in Nepal. Even in the Indian citizens, they are prepared to work as vendors, as in construction sectors, but they are not, prepared to work in the construction in their own country. So this is because it's because of dignity of work. I think we have to work on that also. And now, in this recent time, I'm really worried about the economic, crisis, because globally, all of us are going to face economic crisis after this post pandemic. And I hope, because we have our international organization, UN organization, UNDP, everybody, as Mr. Shamin has mentioned. I would also like to request, and urge UN organizations, ILO, IOM, to support us, to support migrant workers in migration, and especially our migrant workers who are still stranded in country of destination. We have still, domestic workers, crying to us to be rescued. They don't want to work there, but they are forced to work there without salary. So we are really, really worried about these migrant workers, how we can support them, how we can rescue them, because at this situation, even our embassies, even our missions, they are not supporting them because of I think they're fright of the corona, fright of this COVID. So I don't know how we can do it, but we need to rescue them. And maybe international organizations can help us. Maybe our partners, our local partners in country of destination can support us, support our migrant workers in some way because there are issues of suicide cases. Many migrants, they think that corona is fatal, and they are committing suicide. So I really request our partners in destination country to work on this and support our migrant workers who are in country of destination. So thank you again, MFA. Thank you, Rola. This is all for now.
Thank you, Vijaya. Thanks so much. We go to Kaylee for her final remarks.
Thank you, Rula. I'll try to keep it short. I realize we're 13 minutes over time now. So thank you so much, Rula, for moderating this. It's been a great discussion. I just want to say that all of the speakers have really raised really important issues that really speak to structural systemic issues that we're hoping that different governments will address, right? The GCM is all about organizing governments around something it's more concrete, right? But I think we see the limits to that based on this discussion. So I encourage everyone who's a part of this discussion, who's listening, to really become engaged and to advocate for change. And if the climate movement is any indication, the youth movement is any indication, we should be the voices of reason and justice that forces and compels governments to really listen to our demands. So that's all. I'll leave it at that. On a positive note, I think we can create change together collectively. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Kylie, and thank you to all our panelists. It's been a very rich discussion. I'm very aware that we're 15 minutes over time. So with that, I just want to thank everybody, our dear panelists, everybody who participated in this webinar. Next week, we will have another one of these webinars focused on Objective 3 of the Global Compact. So stay tuned. It's the same time, same date. And we will be sharing the information for next week's webinar. I wish everybody a good evening, morning, whatever it is. Thanks so much and have a good day.